Attention, uh, probably in the last 10 years. And we're going to get to a definition of what the neoliberal self is. But before we get there, let's talk about what neoliberalism is. So, neoliberalism can mean a few different things. But if we take all those things together, it can be understood as an economic philosophy, a logic of government, that is underpinned by the idea that the best way to ensure prosperity and well being for all persons is to use governmental power to transform all institutions to operate on free market principles. And a key part of this here is governmental power. Because a key part of the definition is neoliberalism it's the idea that the free market is the best way to ensure prosperity and well-being for everybody, right? But it's not just about the free market doing what the free market does, right? It's about using whatever state power, right? So there's a sort of a contradiction there, because if you think about the free market, it's opposite of state power, right? Because with the free market, the idea is people's patterns of consumption, the choices they make to consume, are what drives change, what drives practice, what drives the structure of the economy. It's people's choices. However, once we start to harness state power, right, at least rhetorically, you can see proponents of neoliberalism will say we don't want state power, we don't want the government interfering, we want government deregulation, we want people's patterns of consumption, the choices they make to drive economic practices and policies and structures. So anyway, so for neoliberalism, what we see a harnessing of governmental power to shape all institutions to operate on a free market. And it's not just to shape it, but to protect free market operations. Right? And so we can see this very explicit regulatory hand operating under neoliberalism. So the foundations of fundamental principles of the free market are the idea of competition, choice, and government deregulation. Right? So in order for the free market to work, we need to have all competition in all ways, in all spheres, and there shouldn't be a limit to competition. People have to maximize their choices. We can't have limits on people's choices. And the government, right, at least rhetorically, the government at least can't dictate people's choices or can't do things to limit competition. And so if we can maximize or optimize choice, competition, government deregulation, the idea is that we can achieve prosperity for all people. That's the way to show prosperity for all beings. Right? And so this is that's the foundational principle of neoliberalism. And so neoliberalism, arguably, and people debate this all the time, like when did neoliberalism really start to be influential in U.S. educational policy and even broader U.S. economic policy. So some people identify Nation at Risk, which is the Ronald Reagan administration's report on public education. And so people identify like the 80s during the Ronald Reagan administration as the point where neoliberalism really became central and centered into U.S. educational politics, practice, and policy. But the Nation at Risk document really it painted a picture of public education in crisis. Right? And so this is really key for neoliberalism. Right? So what critics of neoliberalism argue is that neoliberalism benefits from either actual crises or what they might refer to as manufactured crises. The idea is when we see something in crisis, especially if it's a public good, people are more likely to look to or believe that the solution to that is through private enterprise. So if public schools are failing, for example, the answer for some people might be the privatizing, right? Because a centralized governmental force, the thinking goes, is ineffective for trying to shape educational, trying to shape policy, trying to shape public education in a way that's effective for the population it's supposed to serve. The idea is governments are inefficient, they're ineffective, and private enterprise is the way to go. And I mean, this is very controversial, right? I mean, I can see the arguments for it, I can see the arguments against it, but it's a very controversial. Either one is a very controversial position, but these are discussions and debates that folks are having. And so some of the conditions, right, that people, when we talk about the modern economy, the 21st century, like there's a very particular picture that's presented that's used to justify the adoption of neoliberal policies and practices. One of the things we hear often is that we're lagging in global competitiveness, right? We often see, maybe not so much now, but there's, maybe a little bit now, right? But we often, you often say, hey, we have we're in the middle of an economic crisis. We can even connect the economic crisis to the global pandemic. Right now, we can see like there's a lot of people suffering economically. And so what do we do to solve this? We also hear that there's an inadequate workforce. You sometimes hear numbers saying, hey, there's companies that want to hire, but they don't have the workforce with the requisite skills and knowledge and dispositions to fill those positions. We also hear that even the economic structure is changing. We're starting to see shifts in occupational patterns more, where people, at one point, economists will argue that, hey, it wasn't uncommon for people to stay in one career position for 20, 30, 40 years, or even throughout their entire lives. Now we're seeing people shift careers a few times throughout their lives, and so we see a shift in occupational patterns. And that's important because that becomes the justification for why people need to be adaptive and why people need to be flexible. And I'm going to argue later on that that's a key feature of the neoliberal self. Right now I'm just trying to present the context for this economic picture that's used to justify some of these features of the neoliberal self. And also the changing qualities of work, right? We've moved from a manufacturing to more of like a service position, but service economy. But folks would even say we're now moving towards like what they call a creative economy, where people are required to, in order to participate in the 21st century economy, they need to be innovative, creative, good problem solvers, all these sort of creative type associated fields, right? So we're now living in a creative economy, which requires people to have a different set of knowledge, skills, and dispositions than if it was manufacturing, if they were on an assembly line. And so we can see that there is a changing nature of the quality of work. So we have all these conditions, right? So we have these conditions of the economy, and so this becomes used to justify. So I would argue that the neoliberal self is any type of being, whatever characteristics, dispositions, character traits, knowledge, skills, and dispositions that are featured in representations of ideal workers, I would argue is what the neoliberal self is. And this notion has been analyzed, critiqued, discussed, sometimes under different names. And so you can see here, like Michel Foucault talks about Homo economicus. Fitzsimmons talks about this idea of the managerial self. Rose talks about this idea of the entrepreneurial self. This idea of, and if you take these ideas together, right, the whole idea is that the self is, actually let's go here, where is like, some commonalities across these visions of selfhood is, and this is a key part of the neoliberal self, is the self is a form of human capital. Like the self is something to be developed, to be added, to be worked on in order to increase and optimize its value. Now, most of the times that value is connected to the economy, but sometimes that connection to the economy is not always explicit. And I'm going to argue this for higher order thinking, where there are people who push for higher order thinking that may not be explicitly and rhetorically connected to the economy. However, the higher order thinking has been so deeply entangled in visions for neoliberal selfhood, I think it's hard to ethically promote other forms of selfhood without inadvertently endorsing neoliberal selfhood. So for the neoliberal self, the self is a form of human capital, right? It's always about value. What am I? How can I add to myself? And what can I do? What can I do to add to myself? Right? And so the neoliberal self views life as a project to be efficiently and productively managed, right? And so you're always analyzing yourself, calculating yourself, measuring yourself, and figuring out what kinds of experiences you need in order to add value, right? So you're like a project to yourself to be managed efficiently and effectively. And it's through the choices you make. Part of neoliberal educational policy is trying to teach people, right, to make those choices, to manage themselves, to teach them to make those choices that are going to bring the most value to them. Because part of the neoliberal narrative is that success and well-being is achieved through the choices you make. And so you can see with this third point, happiness, success, personal fulfillment, all of these things are your responsibility to achieve through the choices you make. And so schooling is about teaching people to make good, quote unquote, good choices. Right? And these choices are often centered around the consumption of material and immaterial products. So, right, and so it could be maybe you try to, maybe you join a team because you think that's going to give you good collaborative skills, right? And that you can see how corporations in the vision for the ideal workers, people are collaborative, right? So the idea is we're using visions for ideal 21st century persons to figure out what kinds of experiences, what kind of knowledge, what kinds of materials we need in order to make ourselves, in order to increase our capital, to make ourselves at least appealing to function and fit within the 21st century economy, right? Because the idea is we need to compete for certain socioeconomic positions, and we have to manage ourselves in order to develop the credentials, the capital, in order to compete for those positions. And so we have to consume the right material and immaterial products in order to bring the most value to ourselves. And those people who are successful have done that well, as the narrative goes. And so people have to become these autonomous and rational choosers, right? Who are really thinking about what kinds of experiences to pursue, even what kinds of relationships to develop, right? And that's the social capital part, right? Who do we need to know, right? What kinds of friends do we need? Right, and those friendships become governed by what kinds of return those friendships can bring us, or those not friendships, but even those networks, those connections, those social connections. And so we have to become these sort of rational choosers. And I'm saying rational in that we're using a cost-benefit type analysis in deciding our networks, deciding our experiences, deciding our choices. And so higher thinking, so now how does higher thinking fit into this narrative? Okay, so folks will always speak to, and we can see this clearly, that we've moved from a manufacturing-based economy to more of a service economy or a creative economy, right? The idea is that we no longer require mechanical types, not entirely, right, but right, majority of the jobs are not factory jobs, not the mechanical jobs. A lot of jobs now require, quote unquote, sort of higher order thinking. Higher order thinking in ed psychology usually include self-regulation, critical thinking, problem solving, metacognition, and creativity. Right? These are sort of the 5 higher order thinking skills that are grouped in ed psychology. If you look at ideal representations of 21st century workers, you will see higher order thinking deeply entangled in that vision. And people use those vision for the ideal workers to justify the importance of teaching higher order thinking. Right? And so the idea is we need to cultivate certain thinking skills that are relevant for the 21st century economy. And I get that, right? Because I understand the argument that if the 21st century economy needs certain skills, not teaching those skills can do a disservice to those students. And so we want to be able to teach the skills, the knowledge, and dispositions, right, to support integration and functioning within the 21st century economy. But that's one goal of schooling, right? And you can see that's actually quite counter to what Freire argues, right? Because that's clearly an adaptability goal, right? Let me teach you, I've identified XYZ, so we have these predetermined goals, XYZ. You need to develop these thinking skills, right? And if you develop these skills, you can adapt to a 21st century economy, right? Not clearly, but right, that competes with what Freire would argue should be the purpose of schooling, right? He would say the purpose of schooling should be to dismantle oppressive structures, to recreate oppressive structures, to engage in dialogue with others, to produce a better democratic and just world. Now, so one question is: Are these 2 visions compatible? So I'll call one of these a democratic vision. I'll call Freire's vision a democratic vision, and I'll call the other vision a neoliberal vision. The vision where we're trying to cultivate the knowledge, skills, and dispositions for people to function within a particular representation of the 21st century economy. Right, and so we have a democratic vision that might be formed by Freire: dismantling structures, questioning structures, pushing back against structures, creating better policies and practices. The other one is, hey, can I develop the creativity to function within the 21st century economy? So theorists see these as incompatible. And some people I maybe would argue that they are not, right? But these are part of the discussions. Are these compatible visions? Can they be achieved simultaneously? And there's some folks who say, no, they cannot. Some folks they try, right? They try because they recognize the reality of there's an economy and people have to compete for it. But we're also driven by sort of these democratic goals. Anyway, so we'll come back to that. So the 21st, when I talk about 21st century competencies, there's actually a lot of documents that speak to these competencies. And if you look at these different documents, right, they list different characteristics that are associated with ideal 21st century participants, right? These are the 21st century competencies, and you'll see these throughout the different representations of 21st century competencies. You'll see flexibility, self-direction initiation, interpersonal management, problem solving, critical thinking, being creative and innovative. You'll see that in a lot of different representations, and these are essentially these capture all of the higher order thinking. So if you look at the grouping of higher order thinking and psychology, they map really well onto the 21st century competencies as depicted in a lot of policy documents. Oops. And so one of the tensions is, right, so this higher order thinkings, I would argue, higher order thinking informs neoliberal visions of schooling. Right, so you can see that, right? So when you have these visions of ideal 21st century participants, higher order thinking is, like I said, it informs, it's foundational to that vision. But there's a lot of people who critique neoliberalism and hate on neoliberalism and who explicitly endorse a democratic vision of schooling. Now, we would see from those people, they would also get behind higher order thinking. right? If you think about creativity, problem solving, critical thinking, self-regulation, these could be all seen as important dispositions and traits of people who need to participate in a democratic society, for those people who can engage with others to, challenge oppressive structures and support the creation of new ones, right? People need to be creative for that. They need to be critical for that, right? They need to, they arguably need those higher thinking skills. So then critical theorists, they tend to see these visions as incompatible. Again, I think some people would argue that they are compatible. I think you tend to see that more for proponents of neoliberalism. They would say that they're compatible because they want to have that ethical component to that, or maybe that humanistic or democratic component to the certain educational policies and practices. However, if we see them as incompatible, this is one of the struggles I've had with this topic, is if the democratic and neoliberal visions are incompatible, and higher order thinking is foundational to both of those visions, how can people teach? And I'm going to say, and if they're incompatible and one wants to resist neoliberalism, right? Because if one didn't want to resist neoliberalism, there's no ethical conundrum here, right? But if somebody wanted to resist neoliberalism and push for a democratic vision, how can higher thinking be promoted in ways that are palatable to a democratic commitment? Right? So basically, can you teach higher thinking in ways to support democratic vision without inadvertently supporting a neoliberal vision? And I don't think that's I don't think there's a simple answer to that. But I think it's definitely something worth considering if one wanted to resist a neoliberal vision and endorse a democratic vision, and thought higher thinking was a necessary, if they were necessary set of skills and dispositions to cultivate. How can you do that without inadvertently supporting neoliberal vision? And this is something that I've tried to engage with in my research, but it's definitely an important question. It's something to consider and think about with this topic.